What would you do if zombies took over your hometown?
And so I would be walking to class and there would be like zombies kind of laid across the street.
Or how about a superhero flying through the streets?
Is that?
Yep.
Are those?
Yeah.
It could happen if you live in Wilmington, North Carolina, or Atlanta, Georgia. For decades, Hollywood has set up shop in the South. It's brought blockbuster franchises, hit TV shows, and big economic boosts to the region.
I've always sort of kept that in my head that the best life that I could imagine was to be able to work in the film business in North Carolina.
But in that time, the industry has undergone some major changes. Today, the talent follows the tax breaks, and each state has to adapt to stay in the game.
What are the tools that we have, or what's the current situation, and how do we keep North Carolina top of mind?
I'm Anissa Khalifa. This is The Broadside, where we tell stories from our home at the crossroads of the South. This week, my colleague Charlie Shelton Ormond looks at the evolution of our new Southern Hollywood.
Hey, I'm Jared. I'm an editor here at The Broadside. WUNC provides important local news that our community relies on. But we're also committed to telling the stories of North Carolinians that you might not hear anywhere else. Your support makes all of that vital work possible. So make a contribution so that we can continue telling stories that inspire and inform. And right now, your contribution enters you to win a trip for two to the destination of your choice. So please give at the link in the show notes. And thank you so much.
Back in the mid-90s, Jonas Pate was in his 20s, living in a tiny apartment on the North Carolina coast.
When I first got out of college, I moved down to Wrightsville Beach to write a script.
But to turn any script into a movie, you need money. Thankfully, Jonas heard about someone in nearby Wilmington who had some connections.
And when I was down here and I'd finished that script, I knew Dennis Hopper had owned this building down on Front Street.
Dennis Hopper, the eccentric actor and director, the easy writer, a Wilmington resident.
He had made a movie in Wilmington called Blue Velvet, great kind of cult movie.
Hey, you want to go for a ride?
No thanks.
No thanks. What does that mean?
I don't want to go.
Go where?
For a ride.
A ride. Hell, that's a good idea. Okay, let's go.
After he worked on Blue Velvet, Hopper liked Wilmington so much, he bought a place downtown.
And this was sort of the heyday of his career. He had been in Speed and he was directing a lot and he was really successful at that point.
Jonas wanted to get Hopper's attention, so he had an idea. First, he got a big bedsheet.
I got a spray paint can and spray painted on it. Hey, Dennis, I have a killer script. Give me a call. My name's Jay, which is my nickname, and spray painted it on there and went down and hung it on the front door.
Next, he called up the local paper.
And I said, hey, some idiot just hung a sheet on Dennis Hopper's door. Y'all should take a picture. So they went down, took a picture, and it was on the front page because I figured this might get his attention.
Jonas waited for a call, but got crickets. A few months went by.
Watching a basketball game down at Wrightsville Beach, and phone rings, and it's Dennis Hopper. And he said, my publicist has sent me a copy of the newspaper that the picture was in, and I'm in Wilmington right now. Where's that script?
Wow.
So I jumped in my car and I roared down there and I gave him the script and became friends with him. He's
amazing.
He's a really nice, thoughtful person. I look back on it now in true amazement that he actually did that. But now that I'm older, I think about how old he was when he did it to someone who was, 22, 23 years old, and how cool he was. And that connection led to meeting the financiers who eventually paid for the movie. He wasn't in it, but he helped make that connection. And then he came to the premiere at Sundance.
Jonas's movie was called The Grave. It's about two convicts who escape from prison to search for some lost treasure.
You ever hear the one about the grave? The
grave.
They shot the film around Wilmington and got it accepted to Sundance. It helped launch Jonas and his twin brother Josh's career in the industry. After The Grave, Jonas went to the West Coast and worked in LA for a while. He got married and started a family, but eventually, Wilmington and its strong film community called Jonas back home.
First thing we created when we got back, Outer Banks.
Outer Banks, the show about a group of teenagers who go on a hunt for lost treasure, was an instant hit when it came out in 2020. For 3 seasons, it's been one of Netflix's most popular shows.
Guys, I think there's a boat down there.
This is my father's.
This show isn't so much fun because it's sort of a mashup of our childhood along the Carolina coast, sometimes in Charleston where my mom lived, and sometimes in the North Carolina coast where my dad lived. And we sort of put it all in a blender. So that's why if you watch it, it's like a mashup of geographic names from all over the place.
I need that.
To Chapel Hill.
Yes, right now.
But despite the story being set in North Carolina and Jonas living in North Carolina, filming for Outer Banks happened around Charleston in South Carolina.
We wanted to originally shoot it in Wilmington.
So what caused Jonas and his group of treasure-hunting teenagers to make their show outside of North Carolina, a state that for decades was the go-to spot in the Southeast for people making movies and TV? Let's go back to the beginning, to the origin story of the state's movie biz.
How the industry as a whole got started was this one man just deciding he could do it his own way.
That's Guy Gaster. He's the director of the state's film office. He's referring to the godfather, if you will, of North Carolina's movie business.
In terms of creating an industry itself, the real catalyst for that was Dino De Laurentiis.
Dino De Laurentiis was an Italian film producer, one of the most prolific producers in the industry. From the 1940s into the 2000s, his name was attached to hundreds of movies. They ranged from the critically acclaimed, starring the likes of Al Pacino.
I'm a police officer! Get over there! Hey! It's me, Serpico! Hey.
To some less acclaimed. For example, the 1970s King Kong remake.
There is nothing whatever to fear! That is an escape-proof cage!
The audience want to be attracted, not by the critics. The audience want to be attracted by a great story.
This is De Laurentiis on NPR in 2002.
You must deliver to the audience emotion. And when I say emotion, I mean suspense, drama, laugh.
In the early 80s, De Laurentiis was scouting locations for an adaptation of Stephen King's Firestarter. Here's Guy Gaster again.
He needed a plantation-type setting, and so he was scouring the Southeast, found a location, Orton Plantation, that he really liked outside of Wilmington.
And De Laurentiis' affection for Wilmington didn't go away after the movie wrapped production. Just the opposite.
Suddenly started saying, why don't I make other movies here?
De Laurentiis put down roots in Wilmington, created a studio, and started cranking out movies. The buzz about North Carolina soon spread across Hollywood. While Wilmington remained a hub on the coast, productions kicked up across the state, with movies like Dirty Dancing.
Told you I never did any of these dances before.
Now it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Last of the Mohicans.
Miss Monroe, they're not strangers.
And The Fugitive.
I didn't kill my wife! I don't care!
By the late 90s, success on the big screen expanded to the small screen as well, thanks to a hit TV show featuring 4 teenagers. Dawson's Creek, set in the fictional town Capeside, filmed in Wilmington. A few years later, in the early 2000s, One Tree Hill came along as the city's next big show. But Guy says around this time, there was a shift in the industry. Studios were looking to lower their production costs, and they saw a chance to do that with state tax breaks.
Believe it or not, North Carolina was one of the last states to introduce something that had previously had major film production.
North Carolina wanted to stay competitive with other states, so lawmakers introduced a tax credit in the mid-2000s as an incentive for studios.
When Dirty Dancing was here in the 80s and The Fugitive, those projects were choosing where to go solely based on location. There was more of a creative decision driving that. Now it's more financial.
It's a reminder that behind every piece of movie magic is a checkbook and a bottom line.
As beautiful as our state is, it's not going to matter if there's not that financial incentive, enticement to bring the project here.
At first, North Carolina's tax credits seemed to work well. Studios continued to make their movies and TV shows in the state. By 2010, the policy offered a healthy 25% tax credit for productions that spent a certain amount in-state.
And for feature films, the most a production could get back was $20 million. And we only had one project over the history of that program that reached that, and that was Iron Man 3.
I am Iron Man.
Iron Man 3 was a huge get for North Carolina. A good chunk of the movie was shot in Wilmington in 2012. Guy says it was a high watermark for the state's film business.
At the time, North Carolina was being considered for those big Hollywood feature, typically called tentpole movies.
But then,
when our incentive changed, that went away.
In 2014, state legislators allowed the tax credit policy to sunset, a huge blow for the industry in North Carolina. But folks with strong ties to the film community pushed back.
Said, wait a second, we don't want this industry to go away. This is important to us.
And the incentives were salvaged with a new look. The program soon shifted from a tax credit to a rebate, direct cash back. But with this change, there were new rules for how much North Carolina could dole out to studios.
There were now caps put on how much per project someone could get.
To help understand the ripple effects of this policy change, let's look at a specific franchise.
Great example, The Hunger Games.
In 2011, the first Hunger Games filmed in North Carolina, around Charlotte and Asheville. This was a part of a gigantic series. Sequels were a guarantee because the first one did great at the box office.
But in doing so, then all of a sudden the stars went from each making under $1 million to making multiple millions.
Now, with several multi-million-dollar actors on their payroll, ramping up their expenses, the studio wanted to film in a state where they could cash in on a good tax break.
In North Carolina, you can only count the first $1 million of an individual's pay toward your in-state spending total.
So a cap on how much a production could get back. But in a state like Georgia,
there is no cap. When you look from a business side, if all of a sudden you've got 3, 4, 10 people that are making over $1 million, you can go to Georgia and get all of their salary to count as part of your spending.
And that's exactly what happened with The Hunger Games. The studio moved filming from North Carolina down to Georgia for the sequels. And with it, lots and lots of money spent within the state. It's far from the only blockbuster franchise that's found a home in Georgia. The Avengers, Fast and Furious, The Walking Dead. For more than a decade now, countless movies and TV shows have filmed in Georgia, thanks to a much more appealing tax break.
They've now built a multi-billion-dollar industry in Georgia, all the Marvel movies, a ton of Netflix things, like it's massive.
Jonas Pate again, co-creator of Outer Banks.
Credit to them because they saw an economic opportunity that we frankly squandered.
It's cemented Atlanta as the current Hollywood of the South. But can North Carolina get back a piece of that pie? And is there even enough to go around? That's coming up after a break. As the director of North Carolina's film office, it's Guy Gaster's job to help recruit projects to film in the state. He says to do that, it's important to know what kinds of productions are a good fit for the state's incentives.
Those mid-budget size projects, that's why we're not going and talking with the people that are making the superhero movies necessarily, because of how big their budgets are, and it just isn't going to necessarily make financial sense to them to come to North Carolina, whereas the other projects that don't have that big of a budget are willing to do it and see that they can be here and not be shooting at the same time as those that are in spandex.
Guy says no superheroes, no problem.
Unfortunately, we're not going to have the next Avengers coming in, and that's okay.
Instead, North Carolina has become a home for mid-sized productions. In the last few years, that's included some horror films, like Halloween Kills and the Scream reboot.
Big name horror projects that did extremely well at the box office, that got a lot of buzz and made perfect sense for coming here because they were the top dog.
Since 2020, the pandemic and labor strikes have caused dips in the industry everywhere. But Guy says if everything is firing on all cylinders, he expects productions in North Carolina to spend in total about $300 million a year.
You definitely see the bones and the structure and what worked before and how that's carried over, but it's in a new vehicle, and hey, it's starting to pay off.
On top of pandemics and labor strikes, Guy has also had to navigate fallout from public policy, like Jonas Pate's show Outer Banks. For the first 3 seasons, it's filmed primarily in South Carolina, even though Jonas wanted to originally shoot in Wilmington. But a divisive law from 2016 upended that plan.
The so-called bathroom bill in North Carolina has caused public outcry in and out of the state.
Provisions requires people to use the bathroom corresponding to the sex listed on their birth certificate.
And it's cost North Carolina a lot of money. Businesses and events have pulled out in protest over the law.
The remnants of HB2 was still on the books, which was an anti-trans law. There was, a lot of backlash against that law, and a lot of industries, left the state.
North Carolina's Democratic Governor Roy Cooper has signed a bill that repeals and replaces a controversial law.
It was mostly repealed, but not completely. And because of that, Netflix asked us to shoot in South Carolina.
When I chatted with Jonas, he was shooting Outer Banks' 4th season. At the time, production was at a standstill because of the actors' strike. But he said once filming resumed, there were plans to bring the Pogues to the North Carolina coast.
That's where I live. That's where I want to shoot. And now that HB2 is gone and that the film business here is really going remarkably well, so I'm excited to bring more stuff here.
The 4th season is set to be released later this year. Most filming still happens in Charleston, but Jonas and his crew have shot some scenes in his hometown. Okay, let's talk about Georgia, the state that has taken the throne in the South and has even started to challenge California as the #1 spot to film in the country.
I had just been having this conversation with my mom, who is also a native Atlantan, and she was like, I cannot believe that 69,000 people moved to Atlanta in 2023. Like, what on earth?
Jewel Wicker vividly remembers when she realized film and TV in Atlanta were the real deal. It was 2010, and she was going to college at Georgia State University.
I would come out of class, and Georgia State, for people who aren't familiar, is in downtown Atlanta, and it's kind of spread out throughout the downtown. And so I would be walking to class, and there would be like zombies kind of laid across the street. At first, I would think it was a person, and I would get closer and be like, this is there were props. And they would be filming The Walking Dead on campus. Or, I would be trying to drive home, and there's this bridge that I would cross to get on the highway, and there was a truck dangling off the bridge, and it was for a scene in The Walking Dead, right? And I was now seeing these really tangible, visible imagery about the film scene popping up.
Jewel is an Atlanta native. She says before film came to town, another slice of the entertainment industry reigned supreme in the city.
So I grew up in Atlanta at a time where we had really a robust music scene. And I always joke with people that I thought everyone grew up with rappers coming to their middle and high school, which, as an adult, I realize is kind of ridiculous. But that was how accessible the music industry felt to me.
The city still has that music business, but Jewel says for more than a decade, the film scene has taken the spotlight. Jewel is the host of a podcast called The Boom out of WABE in Atlanta. It's a show about the film and TV industry in Georgia.
The thing that I hear when I'm interviewing people about why they want to work in Georgia's film scene is two things. One, obviously, the tax credit has brought work here, right? So they can come here and they can actually get work. They can have a steady, kind of stable career here. But two, it's in comparison to a place like New York or LA, it's much more affordable, right? Especially, maybe not for the locals, right? Like the people like me who have been here, we're like, wow, prices are crazy. But if you came from New York or you came from LA, it's like, oh my God, this is a steal. And so they're coming for the affordability, right? They can get stable work, has all of these elements of a big city, although you kind of get that intimate Southern hospitality feel to it too. You have this really diverse landscape that makes it possible for it to be quote unquote anywhere USA, which is right, that idea. My producer Kevin and I went on a tour to the studio called Trilith, which is a really big studio here. And we're like driving and they're like, welcome to Wakanda, right? And it's just really this random stretch of grass that has been so many different places in Marvel films and all of these other films because they can really transpose any type of atmosphere on this one stretch of land. And so I think that's true about Georgia's landscape.
So for more than 10 years, Georgia has benefited from a booming film industry. But recently, there's been some in the state legislature who said, wait a minute, maybe we should pull back the reins on these tax breaks.
So kind of for context, it's an income tax credit that we're up to 30% of the spend for in-state productions.
Let's break down this enticing 30% tax credit. So let's say a studio is based out of LA, but they come to Atlanta to film a movie. If they spend a certain amount in Georgia, at least $500,000, they're eligible for this tax credit. It's a 20% incentive, and then another 10% if they put Georgia's peach logo in the movie's end credits. But
if you have a production that's not based here, right, what are they going to do with the tax credit? They're not here.
So what this LA studio can do is sell their tax credit to a Georgia company.
They can sell it to a company that is here, at a slight loss. That's how it's feasible for them, and that's how it's lucrative for them.
But here's what worries some state lawmakers. If companies based in Georgia purchase a bunch of credits, bank them up, and then redeem them all at once, it would be a big financial hit for the state.
The AP reported earlier this year that Georgia is projected to give out $1.35 billion in credits this year alone. And, that's significant. Supporters of this industry say this is what has allowed Georgia's film industry to thrive and to flourish. And if we cap that, or if we make it non-transferable or any of these things, well, then productions are just going to go to another place that has a more enticing incentive, right? There are other places that have film and tax incentives. And if we don't have the one that's the most enticing, they'll go somewhere else. But the opponents of that say that it's just not worth it, right? They're saying that are Georgians seeing enough jobs? Are they getting enough for this tax credit? And so lawmakers are saying, is this something that we want to continue? And they tried to pass legislation kind of pulling that back a little bit earlier this year, and it wasn't successful, which I think speaks to the lobbying efforts of the film industry and how powerful, that industry has become here. But that doesn't mean they're not going to keep trying in future years, and I think that we will continue to see conversations about this. This certainly wasn't the first year, and I certainly don't think it'll be the last year that we'll continue to see conversations about Georgia's film tax credit and if it's worth it to Georgians who are, living and working here.
Okay, so Georgia's position in Southern cinema is still strong. There's a steady stream of money and jobs still coming into the state. But Jewel brought up something folks in North Carolina said also. The money coming in is nice, but what's most important is how the stories are being told and who is telling them.
Georgians are very, even in music and film and entertainment in general, Georgians are very protective of their image, and they're very protective of this idea that no one can tell their Southern experience like they can. I think that really plays a role in this advocacy that, hey, if you're going to tell our stories, involve us, film here, really make sure that we're a part of the process.
For Jonas Pate, that means continuing to build up film as a business for the next generation of Southern filmmakers.
I hope North Carolina starts to see film as a legacy business, like agriculture or textiles. Like, it's been around now for coming up on 50 years in the state. There have been many successes that the state can point to. So think of it as homegrown. It's a homegrown business.
This episode of The Broadside was produced by Charlie Shelton Ormond. Our editor is Jared Walker. Our executive producer is Wilson Sayre. The Broadside is a production of WUNC North Carolina Public Radio and is part of the NPR network. You can email us at broadside@wunc.org. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a rating, a review, or share it with a friend. I'm Anissa Khalifa. Thanks for listening, y'all. We'll be back next week.